Welcome back to the channel. And if you are new here, you have chosen the perfect story to find us with. Because what I am about to tell you tonight is the kind of tale that will stay with you long after the last word. Before we begin, do me a favor and hit that like button, because this story deserves it. And make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a night like this one. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about a girl who saved what she thought was a broken, dying pup, and the ancient, forbidden truth the moon refused to keep hidden any longer. Lyra Ashvale had learned very early in her life that the world did not make room for people like her. She was Omega, born in a bloodline that had once been celebrated for its healing gifts, a lineage that the elders of Clan Duskmere quietly referenced in their oldest records, and just as quietly refused to acknowledge in living practice. Her grandmother had been a great healer. Her mother had carried the gift in diluted form. By the time it reached Lyra, the clan had decided that healer Omegas were an inconvenience rather than an asset, that their tendency to form bonds with injured creatures was a liability in a pack that prided itself on strength above all other virtues. So Lyra grew up in the margins of Duskmere, skilled enough to be called upon when someone needed a wound dressed or a fever broken, invisible enough that she was never invited to the fires, never consulted in councils, never thanked, in the ways that mattered. She lived in a small stone cottage at the northeastern edge of the clan's territory, close enough to be summoned and far enough away that no one had to think about her when they did not need something from her hands. She did not call herself lonely. She had her herb garden, which was extraordinary in its variety because she had spent years cultivating every plant that the forest's edge offered. She had her journals, thick volumes filled with observations about wound, patterns and fever progressions, and the way certain roots behave differently, depending on which moon they were harvested under. She had her window, which looked out over a stretch of forest that the clan called the Thorn Margin, a belt of ancient trees so dense and so old that the pack's territorial maps simply marked the area with the word forbidden and left it at that. No one went into the Thorn Margin. The stories said something lived there. The elders said the stories were superstition. But no elder had ever actually walked into those trees, and Lyra noticed, in the way she noticed everything quietly and from a distance, that their certainty on the subject was the brittle kind, the kind that is louder than it needs to be because it is covering something. On the night the storm came, Lyra was already awake. She had been awake for most of that week, actually, because there was a particular quality to the air near the Thorn Margin that had been changing in the days before the storm arrived. It was a pressure, a low and constant hum that she could feel in the back of her teeth and along the insides of her wrists, where her pulse ran closest to the surface. She had tried to write it down, and found that her words kept failing her. It was not quite sound. It was not quite sensation. It was something that existed in the space between the two, something that she suspected her healer's bloodline was picking up the way a thread picks up vibration from the thing it is connected to, faint and persistent, and impossible to ignore. The storm broke just past midnight. Lyra sat at her work table with a candle and her latest journal, listening to the rain hammer the roof and watching lightning illuminate the tree line in white and purple bursts. She was not frightened of storms. She had always found them clarifying in a way that calm weather was not, as though the violence of a storm scoured something clean in her thinking and left her mind quieter on the other side. She was making notes about a patient she had seen 3 days prior, a young pack member who had come to her with an infected bite that the clan's official healers had dismissed as minor when she heard the sound. It was not loud. That was what made it stop her hand mid-sentence. The storm was producing an enormous amount of noise, rain and wind and thunder rolling in from the north. And underneath all of that was a sound so small and so specific that she should not have been able to hear it at all. A whimper. Low and broken, and coming from the direction of the Thorn Margin. Lyra sat still for a moment. She told herself it was the wind shaping itself around the trees in a way that mimicked something living, which was a thing that storms did, and which she had observed before. She went back to her notes. She wrote half a sentence. The whimper came again, and this time it was not ambiguous at all. It was pain, specific, real and young. She was pulling on her cloak before she had finished making the decision to do so. This was a habit of hers, this tendency to act from instinct before her rational mind could construct objections, and she was aware that the clan considered it one of her more irritating qualities. A proper omega, she had been told more times than she could count, deliberates. A proper omega consults. A proper omega does not go running into the dark, because something sounded like it might be hurting. Lyra had always found this particular instruction impossible to follow, not out of defiance, but out of something deeper than deliberation. Something that lived in the part of her that was made of her grandmother's gift, and her mother's quieter version of it. Something that did not have a word in the clan's vocabulary, because the clan had stopped valuing what it named. She followed the sound to the very edge of the thorn margin, to the place where the territorial markers stood in a line, and the old trees began. The rain was coming down in sheets, and her lantern was nearly useless against the dark, but her eyes were good in the way that Healer Omega's eyes often were, calibrated for finding things in low light because injury did not always happen at convenient hours. She moved the lantern in a slow arc and found it within a few seconds of serious looking. A pup, curled against the base of the outermost tree, half inside the thorn margin's boundary and half outside of it, wet to the bone and visibly trembling. It was small, smaller than it should have been for the age she estimated from its proportions, and its coat was a color she had never seen on a wolf pup before. Not quite black and not quite gray, but something in between that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was not moving, except for the shivering, and one of its back legs was bent at an angle that made Lyra's healer's mind catalog immediately. Fracture, possibly compound, certainly painful, certainly recent, given the way the surrounding fur was still wet with blood, rather than, dried. She crouched down. The pup's eyes opened. They were gold. Not the warm amber that was common in the pack's shifted forms, but a true deep gold, the color of old coins, or autumn light through honey. And they were looking at her with an attention that made Lyra's breath stop for a moment without her understanding why. Pups did not look at you like that. Pups were unfocused, instinct-driven, bewildered by their own pain and the size of the world. This pup was looking at her the way that someone who had been waiting looks at the person they have been waiting for, with recognition, with something that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, was in the same territory as relief, was the thing that relief becomes when it has been held in reserve for a very long time. She said quietly, "I'm going to pick you up. I'll be careful." The pup did not make a sound. It watched her reach for it with those impossible gold eyes, and it did not flinch, did not snap, did not exhibit any of the fear aggression that an injured animal in pain would typically produce. It simply watched her, and when her hands closed carefully around its small body, and she lifted it against her chest, she felt something happen that she could not immediately explain. A warmth that was not related to the pup's body heat. A settling, like something clicking into a position it had been seeking. A faint vibration in her sternum that matched the one she had been feeling in her wrists for days. And she had the sudden, disorienting conviction that she had just completed a circuit that had been open and waiting for a very long time. She told herself it was the healer's bond, the connection that formed when a gifted healer made contact with a patient in genuine need. She had felt versions of it before, smaller and less insistent versions, and she told herself that this was just a stronger iteration because the pup was in more distress than her usual patients, or because the storm was affecting her own sensitivity, or because she had not slept properly in a week, and her perceptions were therefore unreliable. She told herself all of this very firmly, and then she walked back through the rain to her cottage with the pup held carefully against her heart. And she did not examine too closely the way her own heartbeat had changed its rhythm to something slower and more even, something that felt less like her own pulse and more like a shared one. She set him on her work table, cleared to one side, and began the work of assessing the damage properly. The leg was fractured but not compound, which was better than she had feared. The bone had bent under stress rather than breaking cleanly through, and with proper splinting and several weeks of rest, it would heal without complication. There were minor lacerations along his flank, consistent with moving through dense undergrowth at speed, or being thrown through it, though she pushed that second interpretation aside because it raised questions she did not yet know how to hold. His temperature was low from exposure, but not dangerously so. He was malnourished in a way that suggested he had been subsisting on very little for some time, not days, but weeks, which was strange for a pup of his estimated age because pups of his estimated age were typically still with their mothers and their pack and had no reason to be subsisting on anything at all. She worked steadily and without speaking, which was her habit with patients, because she had found that silence communicated competence in a way that speech sometimes undermined, that the hands doing the work were more reassuring than anything the voice could offer. She cleaned the lacerations. She set the splint with the careful precision that was her best skill, the thing she was genuinely better at than any other healer she had encountered, an intuitive understanding of how bones wanted to sit and what they needed to return to themselves. She wrapped the leg with strips of linen soaked in, a compound she prepared from memory, willow bark and comfrey, and 2 other things she had identified herself through years of trial and documented observation, a formula that no one at Duskmere had ever asked her to share, because they had never quite believed the results it produced. Throughout all of this, the pup watched her, not with the glazed half-awareness of an animal in shock, with attention, with that same quality of focused recognition that had stopped her breath at the thorn margins. Edge. When she finished and sat back on her stool, he blinked slowly, once. And it was so deliberate, so communicative, that Lyra found herself blinking back before she caught herself. "You're not going to tell me where you came from, are you?" she said. It was not quite a question. He did not make a sound. He watched her. "Fine," she said. "You can stay until the leg heals. That's going to be at least 3 weeks, possibly 4. I don't expect gratitude, but I do expect you to eat what I give. You and not make a mess of the herb bundles. I've spent years on some of those." She was not sure why she was talking to him as though he could understand. She had always talked to her patients. It was part of her practice. The belief that language reached something in a healing body, even when the mind was not fully present to receive it. But she was talking to this pup the way she talked to adults, with specificity and expectation, and he was receiving it the way adults did not. With that complete, still, unblinking attention that made her feel simultaneously very seen and very uncertain. She gave him water, which he drank carefully. She gave him a small amount of food, which he ate slowly, and without the frantic urgency of a truly starving animal, which was another strange thing to add to the list she was compiling without quite meaning to. She made a bed for him from a folded blanket in the warmest corner of the cottage, near the small hearth that she kept burning through the cold months. He allowed himself to be moved there without protest, settled into the blanket with a slow breath, and was asleep within minutes. Lyra sat at her work table for a long time after that, and looked at him and tried to identify what she was feeling. The warmth in her chest had not faded. The resonance in her wrists was different now. Not the searching vibration of the past week, but something quieter and more settled, as though it had found its answer and was resting in it. She pressed her fingers to the inside of her left wrist and felt her own pulse, and underneath it, or alongside it, or woven through it in a way she did not have language for. Something else. Something that breathed when he breathed, and was still when he was still. She went to bed and told herself very firmly that she was sleep-deprived, and that her imagination was doing things that proper rest would correct. She did not entirely believe herself. If you're already feeling like something is off about this, pup, you are paying attention exactly the way this story wants you to. Drop a comment and tell me what you think is happening, because I want to know if you have guessed it yet. And if you haven't subscribed, now would be a really good time, because what comes next changes everything. In the days that followed, Lyra established a routine around her unexpected guest that felt, unsettlingly, like it had always been there, waiting for her to step into it. She woke each morning and checked the splint, and the lacerations with the professional care she brought to all her patients. She prepared his food with more attention than strictly necessary, selecting things that her knowledge told her would support bone healing and immune function, adding specific herbs to his water at measured intervals. She kept the cottage warm and the noise low, and she talked to him while she worked. Not incessantly, but in the way she had discovered calmed healing bodies, steady and low, and without the particular quality of anxiety that disrupted recovery. He ate everything she gave him. He slept a great deal in those first several days, which was appropriate for the degree of healing his body was attempting. But his sleep was different from animal sleep, in ways she catalogued with the precision of someone who did not entirely trust her own perceptions. He did not twitch. He did not make the small sounds that sleeping pups made. He lay still, and breathed with an evenness that was not the shallow, rapid rhythm of an animal in rest, but the deep, slow breath of something that was doing something more deliberate than simply sleeping, something that looked from the outside like sleep, but was from the inside. She suspected something else entirely, and when he was awake, he watched her. This was the thing she kept returning to when she sat with her journal in the evenings. The quality of his attention. She had worked with injured animals her entire adult life, had developed a reputation within her own small sphere for being able to handle creatures that other healers could not manage, because she understood animal communication and animal fear and the specific body language that told you what a creature needed and what it would and would not tolerate. She knew what animal watchfulness looked like. This was not that. Animal watchfulness was reactive, responsive to sound and movement, calibrated to assess threat. This was something she found herself calling, in the privacy of her journal, and with the awareness that she would not want anyone else to read this particular entry. Patient, deliberate, anticipatory in a way that suggested he was watching her learn him and waiting to see what conclusions she would draw. On the 5th day, she sat across from him while he was awake and simply looked back. She had decided, in the way she made decisions, which was suddenly and completely, after a period of circling, that she was going to stop performing normalcy about this situation and simply observe it with the clarity she brought to everything else. "You understand me," she said. Not a question this time. He looked at her. That slow, complete, ancient gold attention. "Not in the way that animals sometimes understand tone and intention," she said. "You understand my words. Individually. You follow sentences. I've been watching you follow sentences for 5 days and I've been pretending I wasn't." Nothing changed in his expression, but something changed in the quality of the stillness, some almost imperceptible shift toward acknowledgement, toward a lessening of the concealment that she now realized had been in place all along. "I'm not going to tell anyone," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever is happening here, whatever you are, I'm not going to tell the clan. They didn't send me into that storm. They didn't look for anything at the thorn margin's edge. I made a choice to pick you up and bring you inside, and I'm making a choice to keep making that choice until your leg is healed and you can decide what happens next. Okay?" He blinked. Slowly. Deliberately. She had taken to calling that his yes. She nodded. "Okay." She went back to her work, and the cottage was quiet, and the warmth in her chest, the resonance in her wrists, the shared rhythm of their breathing. None of it faded, and none of it frightened her the way it perhaps should have. She was a healer who had spent her entire life being told her perceptions were too strong, her bonds too easily formed, her gift more burden than asset. She was 31 years old, and she had never had a patient she was afraid to know. She was not going to start now. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because the records that would have told her had been removed from Duskmere's archive 40 years before her birth, was that the warmth and the resonance and the shared rhythm were not products of her healer's bond. They were products of something far older and far more specific. They were the first threads of a soul tether, the rarest of all supernatural bonds, one that could only form between a primordial and the singular person in all living existence whose soul was constructed to hold the other half of a primordial's own. The bond did not ask permission. The bond did not care about clan politics or territorial maps. or the fact that the primordial in question had been sealed into a diminished form for 5 centuries by a council of wolves who had decided that his existence was inconvenient to their ambitions. The bond recognized what it recognized, and it had been waiting, in the particular patient way of very old and very certain things, for exactly this. In the cottage at the edge of the thorn margin, 2 halves of a very old equation were slowly, carefully, irrevocably finding each other. And the moon was watching. And the moon was counting down. 3 weeks passed. The leg healed beautifully, which Lyra documented with professional satisfaction and personal relief, the bone knitting cleanly along the break in a way that suggested either her compound formula was more effective than even she had measured, or her patient's biology had a recuperative capacity that exceeded the normal range. She suspected both things were true and in proportion to each other. The lacerations healed completely within 10 days, leaving no scarring, which was unusual enough that she noted it twice in her journal and underlined it once. During those 3 weeks, she learned him in the way she learned all her patients, thoroughly and without agenda, cataloging what he preferred and what he tolerated and what he would and would not do. He ate meat, but not in large quantities, which was wrong for a growing pup at his stage of development. He drank water, but seemed to derive something additional from being near her herb garden, spending long periods of his awake time sitting at the garden window in a way that she eventually interpreted as not interest in the plants themselves, but in the quality of the air that came through the glass, as though something in the combination of what she grew there was doing something for him that she had not prescribed and was not entirely sure she understood. He did not play. She had expected this to resolve as he healed and grew more comfortable, had expected the suppressed pup energy to emerge in the tentative way of animals who had been hurt and were learning to trust again. It did not emerge. He was not suppressing anything. He simply did not have it, and she began to understand that whatever he was, whatever he contained, it was not something that had ever been a pup in the way that pup implied. She did not push this understanding to its conclusions. She let it sit at the edge of her awareness, the way she let difficult diagnoses sit before she committed to them, giving it space to clarify, rather than forcing it toward an answer before she had enough data. And she talked to him. Every evening, after her work was done and the cottage was quiet, she sat in the chair beside his bed, which she had expanded as his comfort grew, and she talked. She talked about her day and her patients and the particular frustrations of working within a clan structure that viewed her as a resource rather than a person. She talked about her grandmother, who had been the last healer in the Ashvale line to be genuinely respected, who had kept journals that Lyra had inherited and read until she had memorized them, and whose handwriting she recognized in her own, slightly altered by a generation, but fundamentally the same. She talked about the thorn margin and the way it had been speaking to her in the weeks before the storm, the pressure and the hum that she still could not name, and she watched his face while she talked about this and saw something change in his eyes that she had been seeing more and more frequently as the weeks passed, a kind of contained intensity, a leaning toward her words that was not quite physical, but was entirely real. "You know what that was," she said one night, midway through the 3rd week. "The feeling from the forest. You know what it was, and you're not going to tell me. That slow gold gaze, that absolute attention. Because you can't," she said, arriving at the conclusion she had been circling. "You're not refusing. You literally cannot. Something is preventing you." The change in his stillness again, that micro-shift toward acknowledgement. And this time, something else. Something she had not seen before. Something that looked, heartbreakingly, like frustration. Like a thing that has been unable to do the thing it most needs to do for a very long time, and is running out of the particular endurance that long containment requires. She leaned forward. She put her hand very gently on his head, the way she did when she was taking a patient's temperature with her palms rather than instruments, which was a healer's technique that worked through skin. Contact and something beneath skin contact that she had never fully been able to explain, but that her grandmother's journals referenced extensively. She felt his warmth. She felt that resonance, stronger now than it had been at the beginning, stronger every day. building with the slow accumulation of weeks of proximity and attention, and the particular intimacy of care given and received without transaction. And underneath all of that, for just a moment, she felt something vast. She pulled her hand back. She sat very still. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "How long?" He looked at her. She was asking the wrong question, and she knew it. She was asking the question that had words rather than the question that didn't. But she needed to start somewhere. The gold eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he looked toward the window, toward the thorn margin, toward the trees that the clan had marked forbidden and had never explained. Not really, not with the kind of explanation that held up under examination. She followed his gaze. She looked at the dark tree line beyond the glass. She thought about 500 years. She thought about a clan archive with 40-year-old gaps in it. She thought about the particular kind of silence that is not absence of information, but deliberate removal of it. She looked back at him. "A very long time," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," she said. And she did not mean the leg or the herbs or the food or any of the practical things she had been managing. She meant something much larger than any of that, something she had not yet named but could feel the shape of entirely, the way you can feel the shape of a word in your mouth before you have found how to pronounce it. "Okay, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this is, I'm in it." The moon was 9 days from full. Now I need you to comment below and tell me, did you feel that moment? Because that is the kind of moment that this story is entirely built on. Not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones. The ones where two people make a choice so complete it doesn't need words. Tell me if you felt it. And keep watching. Because in 9 days, everything changes. 9 days. 8. 7. Lyra felt the countdown in her body the way she felt weather changes, a building pressure that was not unpleasant, but was impossible to ignore. The resonance in her wrists intensified with each passing day, shifting from a background hum to something active and expectant, as though whatever circuit she had completed on the night she carried him in from the rain was preparing to close more permanently and was taking her pulse rate with it. She slept less and dreamed more, and the dreams were not images she had words for. They were sensations, enormous and ancient. The feeling of something very large that had been made very small and was straining toward its true dimensions. She did not speak of this to anyone. There was no one to speak to, which was one of the consistent features of her life that she had long since stopped actively resenting and had simply incorporated as a condition of her existence. The clan members who came to her cottage came with injuries and ailments and left without conversation. The elders had not summoned her to council in over a year. Her nearest neighbor was half a mile east and had made it comprehensively clear within the first year of Lyra's residence that proximity was not invitation. She was used to the silence, and she had built a good life inside it. But in those 9 days before the full moon, she was aware of the silence differently, as a container for something that was growing too large for it. He was aware too. She could see it in the quality of his watchfulness, which intensified as the days shortened toward the full. He slept less and ate less, and spent longer periods at the window, looking at the thorn margin with an expression that she had no framework for reading, because she had no framework for what was living behind those gold eyes, except that it was old, and it was immense, and it had been patient for a very long time, and the patience was reaching its limit. On the 8th day, she caught herself talking to him about things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, about the night her mother died and the clan had not sent anyone to sit with her, about the year she had spent trying to make herself smaller, easier, more palatable to the pack hierarchy, and the particular kind of self-erasure that project had required, and the morning she had stopped doing it, with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has finally understood that a thing is not worth the cost, and will not do it again. About her grandmother's journals and the passages that described a healer's purpose not as serving the pack, but as recognizing what was most in need of recognition, finding the overlooked thing and seeing it fully until it could see itself. He listened to all of it. He listened with that total, unwavering attention that she had stopped calling strange because it had become the most familiar thing in her days. And on the evening of the 8th day, when she had finished talking, and the cottage was quiet, and the moon, one day from full, was laying a silver path across her floor, he moved for the first time in a way that was entirely without her prompting. He lifted himself from the blanket, slowly, and with the care of a body that still remembered the fracture, even though it had healed, and he crossed the small distance between his bed and her chair, and he settled himself against her feet. Just that, just present against her feet with the warmth of him bleeding through her wool socks and his breathing, slow and deep and deliberate, matching itself to hers with that precision that she had never stopped noticing. She looked down at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand on his head and kept it there and said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. And they stayed like that until the fire burned low and the moon climbed higher and the night moved toward the thing that was coming. She said, finally, just before she went to bed, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Picking you up, bringing you in, the past 3 weeks, whatever you are, whatever the moon is going to do, I don't regret it." He looked up at her from her feet, those gold eyes in the moonlight. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time and listened to him breathe and felt the resonance in her wrists hum steadily toward morning. The full moon rose just past sundown on the 22nd day of his residence in her cottage, and it rose wrong. That was the only word Lyra had for it as she stood at her window and watched it clear the tree line. It rose wrong. Its light was wrong. Too bright and too active, doing things that moonlight did not do, finding angles that were geometrically impossible given the position of the window and the angle of the trees, pooling on her floor in patterns that were not the patterns of light filtered through glass, but something more deliberate, more specific, as though the moon itself was illuminating certain things and leaving others in shadow by intention rather than physics. She turned from the window. He was standing in the middle of the room, not lying in his bed, not at the window, not at her feet, standing in the middle of the room, in the center of the moon's impossible light, and he was looking at her with those gold eyes, and the quality of the air around him was changing in a way that her body registered before her mind did. A pressure drop, like the moment before a storm breaks, the held breath of the world before the thing it has been building toward finally arrives. She said his name, except she had not given him a name. She had been calling him you for 3 weeks, because she had the intuition that naming him with something that was not his would be a kind of rudeness. She was not willing to commit. What came out of her mouth was not a name she had chosen. It was a sound that arrived fully formed from somewhere underneath her conscious knowledge, from the part of her that the resonance had been building toward this moment, from the healer's gift her grandmother had described as recognition carried in the blood. What came out of her mouth was a word in a language she did not speak, and it meant something she would only understand later, when she found it in the oldest section of her grandmother's journals, in the entry that described a primordial bond and what the tethered soul did on the night of first recognition. The word was his name, and the room came apart, not violently, not in the way of destruction, in the way of a seed casing that has been holding its contents under enormous pressure for an enormous time, and finally releases. The air in the cottage split open along lines of gold light, and the pup, the small dark form that she had been tending for 3 weeks with the steady hands of her gift, expanded the way that a reflection expands when you step back from a mirror, filling toward its true dimensions with a speed that her eyes could not quite track. The gold light was not external. It was coming from him, from his coat and his form and his eyes, multiplying outward until the room was full of it, and she had to put her arm up to shield her face. And then it stopped, and she lowered her arm, and the man standing in the center of her cottage, in the center of the full moon's light, was nothing that the word man had previously contained for her. He was tall in the way that things which have been sealed into smaller forms are tall when released. Not merely large, but dimensionally present, occupying space with a completeness that made everything around him look like a sketch of the room it had been. His coat, No, his clothes, deep gray, appearing from the same substance that his pup form had been, settled around him as though they had been there all along, and she had simply not been able to see them before. His hair was dark, the same not quite black as his pup coat, and it fell to his shoulders with the kind of care that suggested someone who had once known the significance of personal bearing and had not quite forgotten it, even through 5 centuries. His face was a thing she could not have described adequately, not because it was beyond description, but because any description she constructed would be insufficient, would get the individual features right, and miss entirely the quality that made them extraordinary, which was the same quality that had been in his gold eyes from the first night. That ancient, focused, patient awareness, that knowledge of her. His eyes were still gold. She had thought the gold was unusual in a pup. In a man's face it was devastating. He looked at her across the cottage and he said, in a voice that had been silent for 500 years, and sounded it, a voice that carried resonance in it, the way stone walls carry cold, the accumulation of time compressed into a single instrument. He said, Lyra, just her name, the way she had said his, from somewhere beneath conscious knowledge, from the place where the bond lived. She stood very still. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life being steady in the face of things that frightened others, who had talked herself through difficult diagnoses and difficult conversations and difficult nights with a pragmatism that she wore like armor. She was not frightened now. She was something else entirely. She was the person who had said, okay, 9 days ago to something she did not have words for, and was now standing in the full acknowledgement of what she had agreed to. And it was not smaller than she had sensed. It was larger than she had been able to imagine. And she had imagined quite a lot. She said, hello. Something crossed his face. Something she had no framework for yet because she was still, learning to read his full expression. The full range of a face that had been a pup's face for 3 weeks. But it was not nothing. It was everything, actually, pressed into the smallest possible visible form, the way enormous things sometimes compress themselves to survive. He said, you knew. I suspected, she said. I didn't know what. I knew something. And you stayed. I said I would. He looked at her for a long moment. The gold light was fading now, settling back into the ordinary, silver of moonlight through glass, and the room was resolving around him into the familiar clutter of her work table and her herb bundles and her journals. The strangeness was not leaving with the light. It was settling, becoming the new ordinary, the way everything did when you stopped fighting it. He said, my name is Calum Voss, and there was something in the way he said it that told her he had not said it, had not been able to say it, in a very long time, that the saying of it was both enormously simple and enormously significant. A name is a thing you can only say when you are yourself enough to claim it, and for 500 years he had not been. I know, she said. She pointed at the chair beside her work table. Sit down. You've been a pup for 3 weeks, and your leg only finished healing 4 days ago, and whatever that was just cost you something. Sit down and let me look at you. He looked at the chair. He looked at her, and something happened in his gold eyes that she would spend a great deal of time learning to read in the months that followed, but that she understood instinctively even now, on this first night, as the thing that he felt when someone treated him with the same steady care she had been giving him for 3 weeks. Not deference, not fear, not the calculated approach of someone who wanted something from his power, just the practical, clear-eyed attention of a healer telling her patient to sit down because she wanted to check on him. He sat down. She examined him with the same thoroughness she would have given any patient in a significant physical transition, checking his temperature and the alignment of the healed leg and the state of the lacerations that had long since become smooth, unmarked skin, and several other things that she noted with professional interest and personal relief. He held still for all of it, with the patience she had watched him practice for 3 weeks. Except that it was different now. The patience was different. Now that he had a face she could read, and hands she could see resting on her work table, and a voice that could tell her things, instead of only a gaze that waited for her to figure them out, When she finished, she sat back on her stool and said, "Now tell me." He told her. He told her in the voice that held 5 centuries of compression in it. Slowly, and with the particular care of someone who has rehearsed a thing for so long in silence, that speaking it aloud feels both necessary and dangerous. He told her about the primordials, the first wolves, the oldest supernatural bloodline, the ones who had walked the world before. Packs had politics and councils had ambitions, and the distinction between power and authority had been eroded until most wolves alive could not tell where one ended and the other began. He told her about his own bloodline specifically, the Voss line, the eldest of the primordial families, the ones who had carried a particular kind of power that the early council had, called too concentrated in a single form, too difficult to govern, too likely to produce a king who could not be controlled. He told her about the council that had convened 500 years ago in what was now Duskmere's Eastern Hall, though it had been called something different then, and what they had decided to do about the last primordial king, who refused to step aside from a sovereignty that he had not been elected to and could not be removed from by any ordinary means. He told her about the seal, a thing the council had commissioned from a blood mage whose name had been removed from all records precisely because what he had done was not something any governing body wanted attributed to a named individual, a thing designed to compress an immortal consciousness into a form too small to act, too diminished to remember itself fully, too isolated to call on the bonds that might have saved it. He told her about 500 years in the thorn margin, 500 years as a diminished, sealed thing, aware enough to suffer and too constrained to end it, maintaining just enough of himself to remain himself at all. He told her about the seal's single flaw, the flaw that the blood mage had hidden in the working's construction because the blood mage had a conscience that the council had failed to account for. The flaw was this: the seal could not hold against a true soul tether. If a primordial's tethered soul found them in their sealed form, and recognized them and chose them, and built the bond voluntarily, with full knowledge, the seal would fail. Slowly, over the time it took the bond to form, until the full moon after the bond reached its first threshold, when the seal would break entirely. He told her that the blood mage had inserted this flaw, knowing that the probability of it occurring was vanishingly small. A primordial's tethered soul was singular, one person in all of existence, and that person would have to find a sealed primordial, recognize a sealed primordial, and choose to build a bond with what appeared to be an injured pup near the edge of a forbidden forest in the middle of a storm. The blood mage had called it a mercy in the margin of the working, a theoretical mercy, the kind that eases the conscience without intending to be invoked. Lyra listened to all of this without interrupting. She had always been a very good listener. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandmother's journals." He stopped. "What?" "You said the blood mage hid information in the working's construction. The way that information persists is in documentation. Someone always keeps records, even of things that are supposed to be forgotten. My grandmother was a healer in Duskmere her entire life, and her journals describe things that were removed from the clan archive before I was born. I've been reading them for years as medical texts, but there's a section in the 3rd volume that I've never understood, about a healer's recognition and what it means when the bond forms outside the expected range." She paused. "I think I'm going to read it differently tomorrow." He looked at her across the work table, his gold eyes in the cottage light, that vast, ancient attention. And now that it was in a face she could read, she could see all the things that had been in it, even when it was a pup's gaze. The recognition that she had felt from the first moment, and the patience. And now, rising through them, like light through water, something that she recognized from her professional life as the look of a patient who has been told for the first time that what they have is real, that their experience has a name, that they are not imagining it. He was seen, perhaps for the first time in 500 years, genuinely seen. She said, "You're still healing. Not the leg. Everything. You've been compressed for 5 centuries and you just expanded back into your full dimensions. And that is a Physiological event I've never encountered, but I'm treating it as one anyway. Which means you need sleep and food, and probably a week of relative quiet before we deal with everything else. Everything else, he said. The faintest edge of something that might, in a few weeks, become something like humor. The council, she said, because she was someone who looked directly at things. They sealed you. They're still there. Or their institutional descendants are. And when they find out the seal broke, they're going to want to know how. The gold eyes steadied on hers. Yes, and that puts you in danger. It puts you in danger, he said, and his voice changed, shifted into something lower and more absolute. The particular quality that she would come to understand as the frequency he used when he was speaking from the oldest part of himself, the part that the seal had not been able to diminish. You are my tethered soul. They will know what you are the moment they know the seal is broken. They will understand what it means, and they will act accordingly. Then we need to be ready before they find out, she said. She reached for a piece of paper and a pen. Start from the beginning. The council's original formation, the names of the families involved, every structural element you remember. I document things. It's what I do. We're going to need documentation. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You are remarkable. I'm practical, she said. Start talking. Oh, I hope you are as invested in these two as I am right now, because we have barely started. Comment below and tell me, what do you think the council is going to do when they find out? And if you want to know, stay right here, because the story is just getting good. The week that followed was the strangest and most important of Lyra's life, and it was also, unexpectedly, something she did not have a good word for. She reached for peaceful, and it was not quite right. She reached for purposeful, and it was closer, but still missed something. What it was, she eventually decided, was inhabited. Her cottage had always been functional, had always been the place where she worked and slept, and conducted the private project of her existence. But it had never before felt inhabited in the sense of being full of two presences rather than one, full of the particular texture of shared space that was different from solitude, not in its quiet, but in the quality of the quiet. Calum was not a loud presence. This should not have surprised her given what she had already observed about him, but it continued to strike her each morning when she woke and found him either still asleep, which he did with the completeness of a body that had a great deal to recover, or already awake and sitting with one of her grandmother's journals open in his hands, reading with an expression she had come to recognize as not sadness, exactly, but the facing of something that needed to be faced, the deliberate engagement with a record of what had been done to a world while he had been unable to be in it. He ate more in his human form, which she was glad of, though his appetite was still nothing like what she would expect from someone of his size and the physical demands of his recovery. She cooked for two, which was a novelty, and discovered that he had opinions about herbs that she found both professionally interesting and personally endearing, that he could identify plants by scent with a precision that exceeded even her own considerable knowledge, that he had spent 5 centuries with nothing but the thorn margins flora for company, and had made a study of it that put most trained herbalists to shame. They disagreed about the application of one particular root in a way that lasted 3 days, and ended with both of them being partly right, which Lyra documented in her journal with 2 exclamation marks. He told her more of what he remembered as the days passed, and the recovery allowed him to reach further back into the sealed centuries. He told her about the world before the seal, about the primordial era, and what it had meant for wolves to exist in a governance that was not based on manufactured hierarchy, but on genuine recognition of natural order. The order of the bond and the bloodline and the land, rather than the politics of councils. He told her about the other primordial families, the ones who had been diminished or absorbed into general pack structure over the centuries, the Voss line and the Ashvale line, and 3 others whose names she felt when he spoke them the way she had felt his name on the night of the full moon, as something recognized rather than heard for the first time. She stopped him on the second name. Say that again. Ashvale, he said, and watched her face. She sat back. She pressed her fingers to the inside of her left wrist, where the resonance had lived for weeks. "That's my name," she said. "That's my bloodline name." "I know," he said. The silence in the cottage was a different kind of silence than usual. "Tell me about the Ashvale line," she said, in the careful voice she used when a patient was about to tell her something that was going to change the diagnosis significantly. He told her. The Ashvale line had been the healer bloodline of the primordial era, the ones whose gift for recognition and bond and recovery had made them not servants of the pack, but its central nervous system, the ones who felt what needed to be felt and saw what needed to be seen, and held the knowledge that the pack needed to remain itself. The Ashvale healers had been the ones who documented the true history, the ones whose records persisted even when council authorities removed the official archives versions, because an Ashvale healer did not keep one copy of anything important. They kept many, dispersed in places that only other Ashvales could find, written in the particular notation that her grandmother had developed, and that Lyra had taught herself so completely that she had forgotten it had been taught. "The journals," she said. Her grandmother's journals were not only medical records. They were the hidden archive. She went to the shelf where she kept the 6 volumes she had inherited, the ones that had felt too important to discard and too dense to fully decode. And she pulled out the 3rd volume, the one with the section she had never understood, and she opened it to that section, and she read it with 500 years of additional context, and it resolved from incomprehensibility into a clarity so absolute that she had to sit down. Her grandmother had known about the sealed primordial in the thorn margin, and had been waiting, in the patient way of Ashvale healers, for the tethered soul to be born in a generation that was close enough to the thorn margin's edge to make the finding possible, had written notes in the notation that Lyra had learned, had filled them into the margins of observations that looked like medical text and were also something else entirely. A message from a woman who had understood what needed to happen and had done everything she could to make it possible. The last entry in the marginal notes was dated 14 years before Lyra's birth, written in a hand that was shakier than the earlier entries. A woman at the end of her life doing final documentation with the precision that defined her bloodline. It said, in the notation that Lyra could now read completely, "She will find him. She carries the recognition. Make sure she keeps the journals." Lyra sat with that for a long time. Calum sat across from her and did not speak because he understood, as she was coming to understand about him, exactly when speech was needed and when it was not. She said eventually, "She knew me. She left this for me specifically. The Ashvale line always knew their descendants," he said. "It's part of the gift. She's been gone for 30 years, Lyra said. "She did what she needed to do," he said. "She kept the record. She made sure you would have what you needed." Lyra closed the journal carefully. She pressed her palm flat against the cover for a moment, in something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but partook of both. Then she looked at Calum across the small space of her cottage, and she said, "We have more than I thought. Yes. Documentation. Real documentation. Not just what you remember, but her contemporaneous records, notes from within. The actual era of the sealing." "Yes, that changes things." "Yes," he said. And this time there was that edge again. The thing that was becoming humor in the way that a thing becomes when it has had a long time to compress and is finally finding space to expand. It changes quite a lot of things. They spent the next 4 days working through the journals systematically. Lyra translating the notation aloud, and Calum providing the context that her grandmother's records had left implicit, because her grandmother had known what they documented and had not needed to explain it to herself. Together, they reconstructed a picture of the sealing that was detailed enough to be evidence. The names of the council members who had authorized it, the name of the blood mage, which her grandmother had preserved despite its removal from official records, the procedural mechanism of the seal and its built-in flaw, the legal framework that made the sealing not only a moral wrong, but a structural one. A violation of the compact that governed supernatural governance that was specific enough to be cited and specific enough to be acted on. On the 5th morning, Lyra looked at the assembled notes spread across her work table and said, "We need to present this." Caleb was quiet. "Not to Duskmere's council," she said. "They're the institutional descendants of the people who did this, and their interest will be in discrediting the record, not engaging with it. We need a neutral body. Something. With enough authority to compel accountability. The convocation," he said. "The governing body above clan councils. It's been dormant for a long time, but it was never formally dissolved. If the compact was violated, the convocation has standing to reconvene. Can they be reached? With the right documentation?" he said. "Yes." She looked at the journals. She looked at her own notes. She looked at the record they had built together across 5 days of careful, systematic work. "Then that's what we're going to do." It was at this point that Duskmere found out. Not about all of it. Not yet. What the clan found out was smaller and more immediate. That Lyra Ashfield, the Omega healer at the northeastern edge of the territory, had a visitor. A large male visitor who was not from any pack that the border sentries recognized, who had been in her cottage for an unknown period, and who, when the 2 sentries who had come to check on the violation of hosting protocols actually laid eyes on him, turned around and walked back to the clan hall at a pace that suggested the kind of urgency that preceded council meetings. Lyra heard about the sentries from her nearest neighbor, who stopped at her fence the morning after their visit, and said, with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering information they know will cause consequences, that the council was likely to send a formal inquiry within the day. Her neighbor looked at her cottage window as he said this, the way people look, at things they are curious about but are committed to pretending they are not. Lyra thanked him pleasantly and went back inside. Caleb was standing in the middle of the room with that quality of stillness that she now understood was not absence of motion, but the management of a great deal of energy that was not yet being directed anywhere. He had been doing more of this as his recovery progressed, standing in that particular way that told her the primordial energy was returning fully, and was looking for the boundaries of the space it had been returned to. "How long?" he asked. "Today. Tomorrow at the outside." He nodded once, the deliberate kind. "Then we go first, before the council can come to us," she said. She was already thinking about it, already organizing the structure of the approach in the way she organized diagnoses, finding the sequence that would be most effective. "Before they can control the narrative," he said. "Before they can decide what question is being asked. If we go to the convocation first with the documentation, the question becomes what the council did, and not what I am or why I'm in your cottage. The convocation's nearest representative is in Westmarch," she said. 3 days' travel. Can you travel for 3 days?" She looked at him. "Can you?" She was still tracking his recovery, with the precision of someone who would not let inconvenient timing override medical judgment. The edge of something like amusement again. "I can travel for considerably longer than 3 days. 3 days ago you were still sleeping 12 hours, she said. "Don't let the restoration of your full form make you careless about the fact that you are still recovering from 5 centuries of compression." He looked at her for a moment, in a way that she was beginning to recognize as the look that preceded something significant. Then he said, "You will tell me that for the rest of our lives, won't you? When I am careless about my own limits." She did not look away from her packing. "Someone has to." "Yes," he said very quietly. "Someone does." They left before dawn. Lyra packed the journals and her notes and a healer's kit that she had assembled on autopilot, the hands knowing before the mind what was needed. And Caleb moved through the cottage with a careful efficiency that she noticed was not the efficiency of someone who was visiting a space, but of someone who had been in many spaces over many centuries and knew what was worth taking and what was not. He took nothing because he had nothing. Everything he had in the world was in that room, which was her things and her records and the accumulated material of her practice, and he left it all with the composure of someone who had learned 500 years ago that things were not the thing that mattered. She locked the cottage door. She looked at the thorn margin for a moment in the pre-dawn dark, the tree line that had been speaking to her for weeks before the storm, the place where she had found him. She thought about her grandmother standing at a similar dawn, knowing what she knew, doing what she could with it, leaving the rest for a grandchild she would never meet. She turned and found Caleb beside her. standing in that dimensionally present way, looking at the same tree line. "Thank you," he said. "For the garden window." She blinked. The garden window. The herbs. In the window. The specific combination of what you grew. It was not accidental. He looked at her. "Your grandmother's formula. From the third journal. The one for restorative air. For a sealed thing that needs to begin remembering itself. You were growing it." She stared at him. She thought about the years she had spent developing her garden. The inexplicable preferences she had developed for certain combinations. The plantings that felt right without the ability to fully explain why. She thought about a grandmother who had written notes in the margins of a medical text for a grandchild. 30 years unborn. "She left me the formula," she said. "I thought it was for fever reduction. It is also that," he said. She was thorough. Lyra pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment. Then she pressed it flat against her sternum where the resonance had lived, which was warmer now than it had been even a week ago, building towards something she could feel the approach of the way she felt weather, the pressure of an incoming system. She took a breath. She lowered her hand. "Come on," she said. 3 days travel. And you're going to tell me everything you remember about the convocation's procedural requirements. Because we are not walking in there unprepared." He fell into step beside her. He had a stride that was not adjusted to her pace, but that matched it naturally, the same way their breathing had matched from the beginning. "Of course," he said. They walked into the pre-dawn dark, and behind them the thorn margin was quiet. Finally, genuinely quiet. The pressure and the hum, gone from the air at last. A thing that had been waiting for 500 years, finally finished with waiting. Westmarch was 3 days' travel, and the travel was the kind of time that builds something between two people more efficiently than any stationary period could, because movement strips the protective layers of routine and replaces them with the raw data of how someone actually operates under conditions that are not their chosen ones. Lyra learned that Calum walked with the economical precision of someone who had been navigating difficult terrain for centuries and had long since stopped wasting energy on it. She learned that he observed everything, not with the hypervigilance of someone who had been threatened, but with the deep, continuous curiosity of someone who had been away from the world for a long time and was reading it back in from the beginning. She learned that he did not fill silence, and did not resent it, and did not perform comfort with the chattiness that most people used to signal that they were not dangerous. He simply was, fully and without apology, in whatever silence or conversation the moment called for. And she found this extraordinarily restful, in a way she had not expected. She learned that he watched her in those 3 days the way he had watched her as a pup, with that total, focused, patient attention, except that now she had his full face and full expression to read alongside it, and she was learning to read it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She learned the difference between the expression he used when he was cataloging information and the expression he used when he had reached a conclusion. She learned that when something surprised him, which was rarely, there was a micro-shift at the outer corner of his right eye, barely visible, gone before most people would notice it. She learned that when he was managing something difficult, when the conversation touched the 5 centuries or the seal or the particular quality of what isolation had cost him, his hands were still but not relaxed, a contained stillness rather than an easy one. She learned that he watched her face when she was looking at something else, in the way that people watch the things that matter most to them when those things are not looking back, and she did not comment on this because she was fairly certain she was doing the same thing. On the second night, camped at the edge of a river they had been following south, with a small fire, and the sound of the water and the sky very full of stars, in the way that skies are when you are away from the lights of a settlement, he said. "Tell me about your grandmother," she told him. She told him the things she had told her journal over the years, the things she knew from the journals themselves, and the things she had extrapolated, and the things she simply felt were true about a woman she had never met, but whose handwriting she recognized as her own. She talked for a long time, and the fire burned low, and he listened with the complete attention she had first noticed in a pup against a forbidden tree line in the middle of a storm. And when she finished, he said, "She would have been glad to know you. I would have been glad to know her, Lyra said. You do know her, he said. She made sure of that. She looked at him across the fire, the gold of his eyes in the firelight. You would have known her, she said. The era she documented. She was born into what she called the tail end of it, the last years before the sealing. She would have been a child when it happened. Old enough to see it, he said. Old enough to understand what it meant. And she kept the record anyway. The Ashvale line always keeps the record, he said. It is not obligation. It is what you are. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire, the stars, the river, the feeling in her chest that had been building since the night she picked up a small, dark pup in the middle of a storm and had not stopped building since. That warmth and resonance and shared rhythm that she had run out of ways to misname. Calum, she said. Yes. When this is done, when the convocation has the documentation, and whatever comes next has been set in motion. What do you want? Not what the primordial line needs, or what the Ashvale record requires, or what the bond is building toward. What do you want? He was quiet for a moment. The fire, the stars, this, he said. He meant the fire, and the stars, and the river, and the space between them and the conversation that had been building since the first night in the cottage, without either of them acknowledging it until now. He meant the specific configuration of these two people in this world, with the record they carried and the bond they had formed and all the ordinary, extraordinary days that were ahead of them. She nodded slowly. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Is that also what you want? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, You already know it is. I do, he said. I wanted to hear it. She met his eyes across the fire, and the warmth in her chest was not contained anymore, was not building, was simply present and complete in the way that things are when they have arrived. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and the river kept moving, and the stars kept burning, and whatever the convocation would bring, and whatever the council would do when they found out, whatever the next chapter of 500 years of a wrong that needed righting looked like, they would face it as what they were. What they were was the simplest and the most ancient thing. Two halves of the same equation, finally in the same room. Comment right now and tell me, did you feel that by the river? Because that is the exact moment. That is the one. I need to know if you felt it the way I felt it writing it. And we are almost at the convocation. Stay with me. It's about to get complicated. The convocation's representative in Westmarch was a woman named Elder Soren Calloway, who was neither old in the way that Elder suggested, nor young in the way that her directness suggested, but was rather ageless in the specific way of people who have been doing the same precise work for long enough that their features have settled into the expression that work requires permanently. She received them in a hall that was not grand, but was old, the kind of old that has weight rather than ornament, and she looked at Calum Voss with the expression of someone who has read a great deal about a thing, and is now encountering the thing itself, and is finding the adjustment significant. She looked at Lyra next, at her journals and her notes, and the assembled documentation spread across the table that Soren had cleared without comment when Lyra had asked. She looked at the notation and the records and the contemporaneous documentation of something that should not have been possible to document, because the parties who had commissioned the act had taken specific steps to prevent documentation. She said, How? Lyra said, The Ashvale line keeps the record. Soren looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Yes, of course they do, and something in her voice indicated that this was not new information, that Soren Calloway was one of those people who knew a great deal more than they disclosed, and disclosed only what the moment required. Sit down, both of you. This is going to take some time. It took 2 days. Soren asked questions that were specific and structural and legally precise. The questions of someone who was building a case rather than satisfying curiosity. And Lyra answered them with the documentation, and Calum answered them with the testimony of 500 years of unmediated experience, which was the kind of primary source that even the most rigorous legal proceeding could not easily discount. Soren read the journals. She read them with the concentration of someone who understood their notation, which Lyra found interesting and filed away. On the second day, Soren said, "The convocation will need to reconvene formally. That requires notification of all member bodies, which includes Duskmir's council. They'll move to suppress," Calum said. "They will try," Soren said. "They do not currently know that I have this documentation. When they learn that the convocation is reconvening, they will assume it is a procedural matter, and they will send a representative. Unprepared. That is the point at which we present the full case. And the seal's mechanism," Lyra said. "The blood mage's identity. If his lineage is still traceable, his descendants have legal standing to corroborate the working structure." Soren looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in its vicinity. "The Ashvale line," she said again, in the same tone. "The recognition one. How long have you been doing this work?" 31 years, Lyra said, "though I didn't know what most of it was for until recently. Your grandmother would be proud." Lyra looked at her steadily. "You knew her." Soren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She came to me 20 years before her death. She brought some of what you have brought. Not all. She did not yet have what she needed to make the full case. She said that her grandchild would bring the rest." She paused. "I have been waiting 20 years. The room was quiet. Calum's hand, resting on the table, moved the smallest distance toward Lyra's without touching it, an instinct rather than a gesture, the bond expressing itself through him in the way it had been expressing itself since the beginning, through proximity and presence rather than declaration. Lyra looked at the table. She looked at her grandmother's journals, the 6 volumes she had carried for 3 days and would carry for the rest of her life. She looked at the notation in the margins, the message from 30 years before her birth, the woman who had spent her life setting up what she could not herself complete, and had trusted her grandchild to carry it home. She carried it home. The convocation reconvened 6 weeks later. Duskmir's council arrived expecting a procedural review of territorial boundary disputes, and found instead a formally constituted proceeding examining the structural violation of the supernatural compact in the matter of the sealing of Calum Voss, primordial king of the eldest bloodline, presented with contemporaneous documentation that the council had believed destroyed, corroborated by the testimony of the sealed party himself, and by a chain of evidentiary documentation that had been preserved through 31 years of a healer's careful, unrecognized, thoroughly documented work. The council's representative, a man named Elder Harwick, who had spent his career on the comfortable assumption that certain histories stayed buried, said that the documentation was fabricated. Soren Calloway placed the Ashvale journals on the convocation central table and said that the notation was verifiable by any scholar of primordial era record-keeping, of whom she happened to have 3 present. Harwick said that the presence of a self-identified primordial was not evidence of anything, since primordials had been extinct for centuries. Calum Voss looked at him across the table with 500 years of patient, gold-eyed attention and said nothing at all, and the quality of the silence was its own answer. Harwick said that even if the sealing had occurred as described, the convocation had no jurisdiction over decisions made by a council body 5 centuries prior. Soren presented 3 separate precedents from convocation records, demonstrating that the compact's violation clause carried no statute of limitations when the violation involved the wrongful imprisonment of a supernatural being, because a wrong that was still ongoing did not have a start date from which to measure limitation. Harwick looked at the table of evidence, and the 3 scholars and the elder Calloway, and the woman at the end of the table, with 6 journals and a stack of notes, and eyes that held every argument he was about to make, and the answer to it. And he said he needed to consult with his counsel. He was told he could consult after the finding. The finding took 4 hours. Lyra spent them in the anteroom with Calum, who sat beside her with the patience of someone who had waited 5 centuries for a proceeding and could manage 4 hours. And she spent them reviewing her notes and checking that everything had been presented in the correct sequence. And then, when she had verified this to her own satisfaction and could not find anything she had missed, she sat and did nothing, which was more difficult for her than the work had been. Caleb put his hand over hers at some point during the 4th hour. Not a gesture, not a declaration, just his hand over hers, warm and present, and certain, the way everything about him was certain, the particular certainty of something that has been through the worst thing and come out the other side and knows now, with the clarity that only surviving grants, what actually matters. She turned her hand over and held his. The finding was unanimous. The sealing of Caleb Voss was ruled a structural violation of the supernatural compact. The authority of the council formation that had commissioned it was retroactively invalidated. Ina Ares, institutional descendants of that council, currently constituted as Duskmir's governing body, were placed under formal convocation review, pending restructuring. The Blood Mage's identity was entered into the official record. The Ashvale documentation was formally incorporated into the Convocation archive as primary historical source material, which meant that Lyra's grandmother's journals would sit in the most protected collection of supernatural records in existence and would not be lost. Again, Harwick walked out of the hall without speaking. His 2 aides followed him, both of them carefully not looking at the table where Caleb Voss sat, and had been sitting for 4 hours, and would continue to sit for as long as he chose to, because there was no authority in that room or in any room that could tell him to be anywhere other than where he chose to be. Soren Calloway came to Lyra with an expression that was now fully a smile and said, "Your grandmother said to tell you well done. I'm passing it along 20 years late, but I suspect she knew I would." Lyra stood in the anteroom of the West March Convocation Hall with 6 journals under her arm and Caleb Voss's hand in hers, and the weight of 31 years of unrecognized work settling into its rightful shape at last. And she felt something that she had not felt since she was young enough to not yet know, that the world did not make room for people like her. She felt, completely and without qualification, like herself. She looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her, because he was always already looking at her, with that gold, patient, ancient attention that had been waiting for the right person to look back. She looked back. "I need you to tell me right now in the comments how you are feeling, because if you are not feeling everything at once, then I have not done my job tonight. Like this video if Lyra and Caleb have taken up residence in your chest. Subscribe if you want to know what comes next, and get ready for the epilogue, because we are not done yet. The story does not end with a verdict. The story ends with what the verdict makes possible. 3 years after the Convocation's finding, the cottage at the northeastern edge of what had been Duskmir's territory was both exactly the same as it had always been, and entirely different from it in every way that mattered. The herb garden was larger. This was partly because Caleb had opinions about what should be growing there, and had acted on them. Over 3 growing seasons with a thoroughness that Lyra had initially disputed on the grounds of limited space, and had eventually stopped disputing on the grounds that he was right about most of it, and the garden was objectively better. It now contained several plants that had been believed extinct, which grew here with a vitality that visitors found remarkable, and that Lyra and Caleb found unremarkable, because they understood that the garden was responding to what it was near. The cottage had a second room. This was also Caleb's doing, or rather it was the doing of the 3 packs that had offered labor as part of the restructuring agreement. A practical expression of the Convocation's ruling that the territory formerly organized under Duskmir's pre-review council would transition toward a governance structure with rather more accountability than its predecessor, and rather more attention to the kinds of contributions that had historically been overlooked, which was a category that Lyra had made a formal submission about, and which Soren Calloway had incorporated into the restructuring guidelines with the particular satisfaction of someone installing a change they had been waiting for the right moment to propose. The second room was Lyra's workroom, proper this time. Large enough for the cabinets she had always needed, and the work table that did not have to be cleared to eat on, and the archive section along the eastern wall where the copies of the documentation lived. Organized with the precision of someone who had been maintaining records since she was 17, and knew exactly what future researchers would need, and where they would need to find it. She was in this room on a morning 3 years after Westmarch, when she heard the familiar sound of someone coming up the cottage path. The particular cadence of a step that was not cautious but was not careless either, that moved through the world with the unhurried certainty of something that had been very patient for a very long time and was now very much done with patience. Calum came through the workroom door with 2 cups of tea, and the expression he wore when he had something to tell her that he had already decided to tell her and was now selecting the moment. She knew this expression very well. She had catalogued it in her journal approximately 37 times with variations. She said, without looking up from her work, "What?" He set the tea on the corner of the work table that she kept clear for this purpose, and sat in the chair she kept there for this purpose, and said, "Soren has identified another sealed primordial." She looked up. "Not mine. Not my line. An older sealing, actually, significantly older, and in considerably worse condition than I was." He said this with the equanimity of someone who had processed what considerably worse condition than I was actually meant, and was not going to perform ease about it, but was not going to let it undo him either. "She is asking if we would consult." Lyra looked at him. She thought about the path that had brought them to this room, this morning, these 2 cups of tea. She thought about her grandmother's journals and the notes in the margins, and the message that had waited 30 years to be received. She thought about the Ashvale line, and what it was, and what it kept, and the particular quality of recognition that ran in the blood and did not diminish. She said, "Tell me what she knows so far." He smiled, not the edge of something that might become humor, a full smile, rare, and therefore each time completely devastating, the kind that reached his gold eyes and stayed there. He picked up his tea. He told her what Soren knew so far. Outside, the garden was growing in the early morning light, the extinct plants and the recovered ones, and the formula for restorative air that a grandmother had planted 30 years before her grandchild understood it, all of it flourishing in the particular way of things that have finally been given the conditions they need. The thorn margin was quiet beyond the tree line, genuinely quiet. A 500-year waiting ended, and the forest returning to itself, the old trees releasing something they had been holding for a very long time, and in the workroom at the northeast edge of a territory that was learning to govern itself differently, a healer with 6 journals and a new archive and a full cup of tea listened to the man beside her, and picked up her pen, and began, as she always did, with the documentation. Because the Ashvale line keeps the record, and the record keeps everything else. And that, my friends, is where we leave Lyra and Calum, not at the dramatic conclusion, but at the morning after, the morning after. The quiet one, the one where all the work that needs doing is still ahead, and they are going to do it together, and they both know it, and neither of them needs to say so. That is the best kind of ending. That is the only kind of ending worth trusting. If this story lived in you the way I hope it did, please hit that like button. It means so much, and it helps this channel more than I can tell you. Subscribe if you are not subscribed yet, because we have so many more nights like this one ahead of us, and I do not want you to miss a single one. And leave me a comment. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me what you would have done in Lyra's place when she picked up that pup in the storm. Tell me if you guessed what Calum was before the full moon told you. I read every single one and I love every single one, and you are the reason these stories exist. Good night. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.